Good afternoon and welcome to Praxis Peace Institute's Friday series. I'm Georgia Kelly, the Director of Praxis. Today we are thrilled to welcome Richard Wolff and Harriet Fraad. Most of us have read Wolff's books and heard talks by both of them. We hosted Richard 2 years ago on our Zoom series and hosted both Harriet and Rick in Sonoma live 6 years ago. So we're hoping to bring them back also. Richard Wolff is a Marxist economist and professor emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and a visiting professor at the New School, New York. He has also taught at Yale University, City University of New York, and the Sorbonne in Paris. He has a master's in economics from Stanford University and a PhD in economics from Yale. Wolff is the author of several books, including Democracy at Work, A Cure for Capitalism and Economics, Marxian versus Neoclassical. He is the co-founder of Democracy at Work, a media nonprofit. And the last Praxis Zoom program with Richard Wolff receives so far over 27,000 viewings. Harriet Fraad is a feminist activist, psychotherapist, and hypnotherapist in New York City. She has been practicing as a psychotherapist for 40 years and was a founding member of the feminist movement, owed in part to her founding of the women's liberation movement in 1968. She is the founder of the journal Rethinking Marxism and specializes in writing about the intersection between economics and psychology. She brilliantly interprets our culture, economics, and politics in a psychological framework. So welcome, Harriet and Rick. It's fabulous to have you with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So Rick, I'm going to start with you. The last interview we did, you talked about the sun setting on the American empire. That was about 2 years ago. And since then, we have seen the sun sink a little further below the horizon as the so-called American dream becomes unreachable for many Americans. It might even be a majority of people under 50. But we're also seeing a surge in union organizing and some minor tweaks in social programs that and which relates to more jobs being created too. Do you think Americans are realizing that this endless growth model that lines the pockets of billionaires at their expense will lead to a post-capitalist vision, or are many of the people in unions just clamoring for their share? This could be an opening moment, but it also could keep the capitalist system going by giving just enough crumbs to keep people happy. So I'd like your thoughts on that.
Okay, well, I was going to start with something I don't have to start with because you, Georgia, said it very nicely. The sun was beginning to go down 2 years ago, and it's further below the horizon than it was then. And if anything, I have to say to you as an economist that I'm astonished about how fast this is actually unfolding. But let me do a little bit of history, because for me, it's always the history that gives us the framework within which to understand where we are, and a hint at least about where we're going, which is what you've asked about. The last 75 years were a remarkable period of time. It is the time of the lifetime of me as a speaker, of all of you participating, and of the world we live in. We were all mostly alive in those 75 years, or at some point within them up to this moment. And that period was characterized by a very bizarre circumstance, which is now over. The bizarre circumstance was that every other major modern industrial economy that might have been a competitor of the United States was destroyed either before or during World War II. So that when 1945 came, the war was over, the dust settled and cleared, one country was in better shape economically and politically than it was at the beginning of the war, and that wasn't true of any other country that was a contestant for being the dominant player in the world. Bombs had fallen on Pearl Harbor, but on no other part of the United States, whereas bombs had destroyed Germany, Russia, Japan, France, Britain, and I could go on. So we've lived at a time of a unique situation. One country emerging with no one in a position to compete economically with us. And that economic dominance, and let me give you a footnote, because of the Cold War of the last 75 years, Americans have become used to imagining that countries like Russia, or in most of that period, the Soviet Union, were economic competitors of the United States. They never were, not even in the slightest degree. They aren't today. Let me give you a simple economic statistic you should never let out of your mind. We in economics measure the size and importance of an economy by a crude statistic called GDP, gross domestic product. It's a rough measure of the total output of goods and services in one calendar year in a country. And we compare the size of total output of goods and services in one country to those in another country to get a size of their relative economic importance in the world. For the most recent year, in 2021 or 2022, the GDP of the United States was about 21, 22, 23 trillion dollars. Over the same period, the GDP of Russia was $1.5 trillion. That's an elephant and a mouse. That's not a competition. That's not a threat to American capitalist dominance. It's barely a footnote. Italy has a bigger GDP than Russia. Not much bigger, but bigger. And so do France and Germany and England. But none of them come close to the United States. But over the last 75 years, totally surprising everyone, one of the poorest countries on earth in 1945, China, has figured out a way to do what every country in Asia, Africa, and Latin America longs to do: put its poverty behind it and become a modern, powerful, developed economy. No one has done that anywhere near what the Chinese have done. Not the Brazilians, not the Indians, nobody. The GDP of China, about $18 trillion. Not the United States, but out of any proportion to Europe. All of Europe combined is what the Chinese have achieved. And they were very, very poor. I don't know how many of you have ever had a chance to read any of the novels about China written back then by Pearl Buck. But if you never have, pick up a copy of something called The Good Earth. Pearl Buck was, if I remember correctly, an American missionary in China and wrote about her life there and what she did and what she saw. The achievement of the People's Republic of China is the single most profound economic reality of our time. And it's giving the American people and the American government a very serious set of problems. First problem: we now have real competition. We didn't have that before. Russia never was, and Western Europe really never was, not since 1945. The Chinese have been and are. And this has shocked the United States. Not so clear why, because this has been going on, this process, for at least 30 to 35 years. Over the last 35 years, the GDP of the United States has grown on average between 2 and 2.5% per year. Over the same period, the GDP of China has grown between 6 and 9% per year. That's no contest. That's not close. That's a 3-to-1 ratio, and that's why the Chinese have caught up. Not only have they caught up in goods and services, but they've caught up in the highest technology the United States possesses. We have Google, they have the equivalent. We have Apple, Intel, and all the others. They have the equivalent. Starting a couple of years ago, toward the end of the Trump presidency and the beginning of Biden, Mr. Biden decided to pursue the same anti-Chinese philosophy and approach of Mr. Trump. Let me remind you, during Trump's presidency, he made a trade war targeting China. He made a tariff war targeting China. When Mr. Biden came in, one of the areas that was the most shocking was the fact that there was a corporation in China that looked to be able to produce an Apple telephone equivalent cheaper and better than the Apple telephone. The name of the company became famous because the United States tried to squash the effort. The company, Huawei. You remember reading about it. The Americans arrested the daughter of the CEO of Huawei, a classy act viewed as such around the world. A few months ago, Biden passed through the Congress with the Republican support a program barring the export of from the United States of very important components and finished semiconductor microchips that are crucial, not just for telephones, but a great deal of modern electronics. The idea was to keep China 10 to 15 years behind the top technology coming out of the United States. In October, 2 months ago, Huawei unveiled its own new telephone, which it turns out to contain its own new Chinese-made microchip that works better and costs less than Apple's, which is a major, unprecedented achievement. If I had time, I'd give you 20 more. In this competition, China is winning and the United States is losing. However difficult it is and unpleasant to hear that, you have to make believe and live in a make-believe world, not to proceed on that basis. Now let's go back to the history. When the dust cleared in 1945 with the end of World War II, the colonial empires that had been crucial to the wealth of Europe England, France, Belgium, Germany, Italy, all of them collapsed. The colonial territories became independent. Gandhi led them in India, Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya, the country that King Charles visited 2 weeks ago. But what happened was the United States moved in to the vacuum left by the departure of the previous great empire, which was the British Empire. Indeed, the whole 20th century should be understood as a period of the demise of the British and the rise of the American empires. Now, let's be real clear, folks. Once upon a time, the world was ruled by the British Empire. A small corner, not particularly important, was North America. And after a time, North America's economy grew, and they didn't want to be in the position of having to be subordinated, as they were, to King George III in England far away. So we had that dumping of the tea in Boston Harbor and all the things we learned about in school. And eventually the United States declared unilaterally, we are independent. And the British said, no, you're not. We won't have it. And a war was fought. The War of Independence. To everyone's amazement, the British lost the war. A few years later, in 1812, the British tried again with another war, and they lost that one too. And the independence of the United States was established. Having fought and lost 2 wars, Britain gave up and decided the better deal was to work something out, live and let live, and the United States and Britain had no further wars since that time. But the live and the let live did mean that the United States grew, and they grew far faster, far further than the British. So that by the end of the century, and certainly by World War I, that competition was over. The British were done, and the new empire was the American. Every empire of which the world has any record, the Greek, the Roman, the Ottoman, the Persian, you name it, they were born, they evolved over time, and then they collapsed and died. The United States empire was born over a century ago. It has grown and developed over the intervening century. And you all know what the next stage is. It isn't whether, it's only when. And my judgment as an observer, and I've been a professor of economics here in the United States all my life, we've arrived. The when is going on right now. And that is very difficult. The end of the British Empire, if you ever study British music or British theater or British writing, those people have had a 150-year struggle coming to terms with that empire. Read Joseph Conrad. Read all the others. It's all written, it's all there. If you go to London now, you enter a city in which half the population hasn't gotten over that it's over. That's how hard they hold on. When the new King Charles went to Kenya 2 weeks ago, He was supposed to go and to apologize for the horror of what Britain did in East Africa. The first book I ever wrote, and I've written about a dozen, published by Yale University Press, is called The Economics of Colonialism, Britain and Kenya from 1895 to 1930. If you're interested, look it up. It tells you what the British did. In those 30 years, the population of Kenya was cut in half from 4 to 2 million. There were 4 high schools in 1960 when I went there for that kind of a population. There were half a dozen clinics that didn't have much in them. It's an unspeakable story. But he refused to apologize. He chose instead the word regret. I regret. Those of you that are older may remember in the early 1950s reading articles about the uprising of the people of Kenya that finally threw the British out. It had an odd name. It was called the Mau Mau Rebellion, led by a leader named Jomo Kenyatta. Torture, murder on a mass scale. Didn't work, but the British tried, and they failed. And within 5 years, they were leaving, and they left. And Kenya became independent. Very, very hard. So I want, and I mean this genuinely, I want you to understand about us, you and me, that we are living through a time that is extremely difficult. If you've been the top dog, if you thought it would last forever, if you thought it would be upward and onward forever, in short, if you didn't know anything about history, this is very hard to face. Once an empire peaks out and starts to go down, what begins to happen, and it's very ugly, is that those who have wealth and power begin to develop a single idea, hold on in a declining situation to what you have, so that the difficulties and the pains and the costs of a declining empire get shoved off of the rich and powerful onto the middle and the bottom and the powerless. It's not meant that way. Those who have simply want to hold on. So they don't want you to tax them. They don't want you to burden them. They are afraid of almost everything. If you tell them there's a war of terrorists around the world, all of whom want to come to your country and your house and your garage and your pocketbook and snatch what you have, and you wonder why people believe that, I'm telling you why. Because it's the symbolic condensation of what we're in fact living through. The rest of the world sees this better than the United States. Just like for the last century, people who have looked at the colonial Europeans could see clearly what it was costing them to lose it. 1968 was a revolutionary year, but it came this close to having the people of France facing the loss of Algeria, facing the end of the great French Empire, threatened to get rid of their heroic World War II leader, Charles de Gaulle. Unbelievable. And they've dared not have a real serious hero ever since. They have one clown after another, culminating in Mr. Macron, who is known fondly in France as Mr. Macaroon. And I won't comment on the kind of leaders we are supposed to choose among in this country. Look at them. That's it? That's the best this country can do? These are poseurs. And I'm afraid I mean Mr. Biden every bit as much as Mr. Trump, even though I'm sure we all understand which one is worse than the other one. But what a display. These are people that are representative of decline. Decline. And the reason I press it is I want people to understand where we are. Korea was the first test after World War II. The United States did not win that war. Vietnam was the next test. The United States did not win that war. Afghanistan and Iraq, we didn't win either of them either. And we're losing in Ukraine. Those are the realities. The rest is make-believe. Our corporations in America are in deeper debt than they have ever been in our country's history. Our government is running larger deficits than it has ever run in peacetime in our history. Our population, our households, are in deeper family debt than they have ever been before. We can't organize our economy so that people earn enough to spend enough to keep the economy going. We need them to spend, but we don't give them enough income to afford it, so they solve the problem by borrowing against the future. You don't need a PhD in economics. I have them, but you don't need them to understand that this is not a sustainable arrangement. The United States is now the largest debtor country in the world. Nobody is close. Who are the two countries that are the major creditors lending to the United States? Answer. It used to be People's Republic of China, #1, Japan, #2. It's the reverse now. Japan is #1, China is #2. China has lent the United States just shy of $1 trillion. Why? Because the United States can't function without borrowing trillions of dollars, as we will this year, right now, as I'm talking to you, in excess of $1 trillion. Just this year, but I'm talking about what China has accumulated over years. China accumulates, why? Because China produces massive goods that Americans buy. So we use our dollars and we buy Chinese machinery, Chinese, you name it. And so they have dollars, but they don't buy from the United States because they don't need to, and they don't want to. So they're stuck with all these dollars for which they have no use. So you know what they do? They lend it to the United States government. And because the United States government has to pay interest on the loans it takes out, every year the government comes to you, and to you, and to you, and to me, and demands that we pay taxes, which we do. And all the government does in Washington is function as a collection agency. They collect the taxes we pay and give them, watch me folks, give them to the People's Republic of China, our so-called enemy, because we have to. So on behalf of the Chinese army, which takes this money for itself, I want to thank all of you for contributing to China's defense. You won't hear a word about this from Mr. Biden or Mr. Trump because it's awkward to face these things. And so you pretend that they're not going on, but they are, and they have been. There was a meeting near you in California, as you probably know, over the last couple days. Xi Jinping from China came to see Mr. Biden in California. He also came to see Janet Yellen, the Secretary of the Treasury, whose message to him was, please, Mr. Xi Jinping, we're running huge deficits. I sure hope that you guys will lend us a ton of money because we need it. But that was never mentioned in the press releases either. This stuff is really serious. The mass of Americans who now feel bitter and angry and alienated, taking it out on the poorest of the poor, Latin American immigrants coming across the border, desperate to do in the United States what the entire history of the United States has allowed people from Europe to come here and do. But they are an invading army of people that'll make us sick. Look at the language. This is a society that has no room for these immigrants, no place for them. It isn't the dynamic society it once was. It's closing down. It wants to keep a mass of young people who just want to work and will do it for lousy salaries. The country is in very serious trouble and decline. Let me conclude, and I apologize for the statistics, but bear with us. You know, we're economists. We're supposed to make our living knowing and collecting and interpreting statistics. So I'm going to give you one. I'm going to compare the year 2020, 3 years ago, with today. And I'm going to show you something that has changed that summarizes it all. Again, using GDP, gross domestic product. I'm going to compare the GDP of the United States and its major allies to the GDP of the People's Republic of China and its major allies. The United States and its major allies are called in international economic meetings and discussions the G7. Initially, it was the group of seven. And here they are: the United States, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Canada, and Japan. Those are the richest, most powerful economies, or now to be more careful, those are the ones that were the richest, most powerful. In the year 2020, the total output of goods and services of the G7 was equal to the total output of the People's Republic of China and its 4 allies. What 4? Brazil, Russia, India, and South Africa, a group that is now called the BRICS, B-R-I-C-S, a group that got larger a couple of months ago when 6 more countries joined them. Countries like Egypt, and Iran, and Saudi Arabia, among others. So they were equal, the total output of these 2 blocks. Now here we are 3.5 years later. Total output of goods and services of the G7, 29% of world output on our planet. And what's the percentage of total output in the world accounted for by China and its BRICS allies? 33%. Game over. It's important not just that the BRICS and China are a bigger economic unit than the United States and the G7. It's that they're getting farther and farther apart very fast. Equal in 2020, separated by 4 percentage points in 2023. Unspeakable speed in historical time for this to happen. And here's finally what it means. Every Asian and African country, every Latin American country that has an economic problem, in the past, they would have to go for foreign aid to New York or London or Paris or fill in the blank. They want a railroad built, they'd have to raise the money there. They'd have to bring an engineering firm from there. They had no place to turn. If their economy was in trouble and they needed to sell more, they would have to plead with the Europeans or the Americans or the Japanese to buy the stuff and give them a good price. No longer. They now have an option. They don't have to go west. They can go east. They can come with their plans and play the United States off against the Chinese and vice versa. And they'll take the better deal. And you know who can give them the better deal most of the time? The bigger, richer unit. And that ain't us. And you're watching in slow motion the Arab countries, the Muslim countries, much more willing to speak out on these horrors in Gaza that we're all watching. Mr. Biden, very early after the Israelis started their bombing, had arranged for a meeting in Lebanon or in Jordan, I don't remember one of them, where he would meet with the Arab leaders. After the Israelis bombed for a couple of days, they said, don't bother, we're canceling the meeting. Mr. Biden was excited, and the rest of the Arab world was brought in, and they've had big meetings since. These are all small moments in the decline of one and the rise of the other. So the only remaining question is, will the United States continue to try to control, to slow down, to stop the Chinese explosion? They've been unable to do it for 35 years. They just failed spectacularly with Huawei and the Apple telephone and the semiconductor chip conflict and competition. Or will there be war? Will the United States try to stop China the way Britain tried to stop the United States? 2 wars. And you can see who lost both of them. Will we learn to live together in some way to accommodate? Or will those people who are willing to risk nuclear war become so desperate as the failures mount up? Just before this program tonight, I took a look, as I often do, at the BBC in England, because they have their slant on the news. And for the first time in the year and 3/4 of the Ukraine war, the BBC had a long article. Today, go look it up if you're interested. A long article about, including interviews, the young men who have run away from Ukraine to avoid being drafted into a war they think they cannot prevail in. Up until today, the BBC was gung-ho Ukraine, and we're winning, and we're winning. Each time they lost, they were winning, and they were winning like children. But now, real late in the game, they suddenly are giving me stories about problems on the Ukraine side of this sad, sad story.
So, Rick, I'm going to interrupt here
Please.
Because I want Harriet to have a chance to talk.
Absolutely.
I mean, a lot of questions came up for me. This was just brilliant what you've offered to us today, and such a whole picture. And I just wanted to say a few things before I go to Harriet, because I think some of the things that came up for me when you mentioned about what little has been in the press, finally there's a breakthrough in the BBC, but we are very controlled with what we see. And I think for people need to understand that when they say, oh, I saw these horrible pictures of something, you can't react to the picture without knowing the context. Pictures can be created, made up. Stories made up about them. I saw that in Yugoslavia. So we have to always question the fact that we're getting news curated for us, whether we want it that way or not. So I think that's an important thing. And then one just kind of comical thing. When I was in Yugoslavia in 1989, I have relatives there who were high up in the Supreme Court. And one of them, I was talking to one of them about, I said, oh, you're having elections next year in 1990. And she said, well, you always have elections every 4 years. And I said, oh, well, you only have one party, though, the Communist Party. And she said, well, you only have one party, the Capitalist Party. and I stopped and I thought, you're absolutely right. We only have one party, too. Yeah. And it was a really interesting conversation that developed out of that reality, out of her just making me look at what my reality was. It was no different than hers. So anyway, it was a great discussion afterwards. And now I want to go to you, Harriet, because I want you to explain some of the psychological fallout that's happening from what Rick just talked about, the fading of the American empire, the American dream, which was kind of always a myth anyway, but people still buy into it. People still say, oh, I've got to buy the house. I've got to have this. I've got to have that. And we've got to get out of that thinking. So I want you to explain to us what is happening with people who can't get out of that thinking and still feel like they're failing because they're not meeting the American dream.
Well, one of the things is the American mythology is, as the song goes, you can make it if you really try. And that's, of course, with a little proviso if you were white male, which was always the case. But the country used to be more white. And males used to get a family wage. In 1970, we were the most egalitarian nation in the developed world. And now we are the least equal, the least egalitarian. And what that's meant is seeing that the empire is collapsing. The people at the top decided to grab it before it all disappeared. And in our country, where money talks so loudly, they bought the political system. Our last presidential race took $4 billion to run. Who's going to, who pays the piper? Calls the tune. And what kind of tune is being played? Well, it's a tune that eliminates people's hopes for the future, which were very materialistic in the United States. We will have a house. Well, we don't. We will have seniority in our old age. We don't. The idea of a pension is one of those things taken back. And there have been two very different developments with different outcomes. One development is people are in despair. The Americans die younger every year. We used to be the longest living people in the world, not anymore. And every year or so, we lose a few more years. Now, that's partly because people don't have hope. It's partly because they're buying capitalist food laced with preservatives, which are poisoning them. It's partly because they don't have exercise. It's partly because they're so lonely. Loneliness is equal to smoking at least 2 packs a day. And Americans are lonely. We have fewer people in any organization, a blood drive, a PTA, no less a political party, than were in bowling leagues alone in 1970. There's a book called Bowling Alone that was put out in 2009, and they keep doing the studies repeatedly. It's the same thing. So that Americans have been alone in front of their televisions, watching junk food and feeling disempowered, because after World War II, and as the United States became more and more divided between the haves and have-nots, and the democratic process was bought, people took their millions of jobs to China, to India, to Bangladesh. And the Bangladeshis, this is what they got out of it. The Bangladeshis have been on strike because they have been making $75 a month in their factories. And they want to make a little over 200. It's a huge struggle. So you can see the profits that are being accumulated when you have a business like Zara or J. Crew, and you get the stuff made in Bangladesh for $75 a month that you pay workers. It's certainly worth the freight, even though it pollutes, to bring it back here and sell it for quite a bit. China is the best paid, but the Chinese are paid about $3.10 an hour. So, the jobs went, and with it went the family wage for white males that allowed a man to support dependent wives and children. That isn't so anymore. And the family is breaking down. Women have to work to survive, and women don't want to work the double shift of working all day at a job and then coming home and doing all the domestic labor, the labor connecting men with their children and their friends, the emotional labor of helping their men feel good, the sexual labor of pleasing their men, the child care, and the job. And so they are increasingly leaving. 70% of divorces are initiated by women now, and blue-collar men usually can't find a wife who will divorce them later. So that the biggest emotional tie that people used to have, the grounding, was the family. That's collapsed. 50% of first marriages end in divorce, over 60% of second marriages, over 70% of third marriages. And people who don't have the assets to fight over, or the children that they're fighting over, don't bother, they just split. Costs too much to get a divorce, they just split. And so you have marriages which are some form of connection over, for about 70% of the population. And that was their main emotional tie, particularly for men, because women's primary emotional support is usually not their husbands, it's other women. It's their children, it's the other women that they're friends with and that they talk to about personal things. But when a marriage is over or a relationship is over, men are emotionally really cut off and estranged and in bad shape. One of the things that's happened is people don't want to face that their lives have changed and they're unhappy. So the biggest cause of death in the United States is now suicide. And between 2 and 3 times as many men die from suicide as women. Now, that's partly because men tend to shoot themselves, so that if they change their minds or someone finds them, it's too late. But it's also because they're in greater despair. We have the highest overdose rate in the world, and it keeps climbing. 110,000 people a year You look at the last few years, the last 6 years, over 600,000 people dead, and it's not a national emergency. And most of the people who die of overdose are also men. There have been 510, a little more than 510 mass murders just this year. A mass murder is one in which 4 people are shot, not including the shooter himself. And I say himself because all of them are men, except one was a trans woman becoming a man. So she's sort of half there. In any case, and the ones I studied for several months had 2 things in common. Well, they had 3 things in common. They were unattached to other people in a close way. They had been rejected by a mate or rejected and fired from a job and unable to get a job. The 2 markers of masculinity were, I've got a job and I've got a sex partner. And in the United States, where money talks so loudly, a solution that's been sold to them has been, be a man, get a gun. You can protect yourself from all the fear that you feel. The Bushmaster automatic weapon had this ad until popular protests took it down. And it said, does your wife or girlfriend make more money than you? Revoke your man card. Do you prefer tofu to meat? Revoke your man card. Then it went down with 4 more things that revoke your man card. And then a big picture of the Bushmaster automatic, reinstate your man card. Bushmaster automatic. And so that in fearful, lonely, detached men's ideas, they can recapture their manhood, their power at the mouth of a gun. This is terribly dangerous. People's emotional moorings have come unmoored. Their sense, and deaths go in 2 ways. Young people are the most suicidal. That's the leading cause of death overall, but for young people, which is quite a thing to say about a nation's future. And also for middle-aged people. There's a book called Deaths of Despair by Case and Deaton about how in the South and Midwest, whites are dying faster than blacks, and blacks are poorer and have been more deprived. And that's a phenomenon, and they went to study why. And they realized that these are people who had thought, they thought that by their 50s, they'd be looking forward to retirement at 65. They'd have a pension, they'd have a life. If they were working in a town that had a factory before the factories were exported, they'd have a position in the town as one of the people who was a worker among other workers that he knew. And it's all gone. And now they're in later or middle age, in the 50s or later. They can't get a job because elders aren't wanted. They don't have a pension. The women who counted on being supported for life in exchange for all their domestic and emotional labor and childcare aren't. They have to work, and it's all collapsed, and they blame themselves. How could I be such a failure? But actually, it's the fall of the American empire and the reapportionment of our wealth so that it goes to the top and not to the bottom. 3 individuals own as much as 50% of our country. It's terribly sad. And the markers of inequality are the markers of what's happening in America. There's a book called The Spirit Level that goes over inequality and what it does. And those markers are the level of trust between people, mental illness. And all you have to do is walk around the streets of a city. You will see mental illness like you never saw it before. Life expectancy. Our life expectancy is now lower than Cuba's, a poor country. Infant mortality. Our infant mortality is going up and is lower than Cuba's, a poor country. Obesity and other eating disorders. children's educational levels, the Gini coefficient that compares children's educational levels, American educational levels are falling rapidly. Homicides, imprison rates, and the idea of social mobility, those have been sacrificed. And people don't know that the geopolitical shifts and the end of empire is the reason for their deprived lives, and that we as a nation didn't do what Germany, the most successful economy in Europe, did. They have laws against outsourcing jobs. Even France has those. We didn't. Our labor movement wasn't a socialist, communist labor movement. And so there are these two developments. On the one hand, we're actually shorter than we used to be. We used to be the world's tallest people, no more. And we die younger, and we have less hope, and we have more overdose deaths. But on the other hand, those people who are understanding that the 3% of the population who are employers are taking the wealth, and the 97%, which are employees, are losing their wealth, and they are organizing like they never did before. Labor unions are burgeoning. People who never thought of themselves as workers, like the museum workers in Chicago, or today the researchers I noticed at the Cornell Weill Medical Centers, and the 48,000 staff at all the University of California campuses after they went on strike. Millions of people are on strike because people are understanding that we need each other. And if we're going to win back this country and change our war economy and come to terms with the fact that we had our moment of empire and that we can share what we have, and that those who do the work should get the proceeds, we have a chance. And there is that hope. And one of the things that has happened to accelerate that hope is the Israeli genocide of Palestinian people and of the Gaza Strip, because people who feel themselves who have been robbed identify. There are tens of thousands of people demonstrating all over Puerto Rico. The demonstrations that are in the United States are very mixed. People identify with the Palestinians. And so the United States population that usually cooperates with the State Department is not cooperating. The Statue of Liberty in New York was occupied by Jewish Voices for Peace, JVP, and pro-Palestinians have been in the streets, along with tens of thousands of people. It's shocked the government. It's one of the reasons that Biden is less on Israel's side than he used to be, and is more talking about pauses, ceasefires, and peace. So that we are at a moment when the empire is crumbling, and people are either crumbling in despair or wanting to escape their reality or organizing to change it. We're at a real moment of decision where both things are happening in spades. And it's an exciting moment to live in.
Yes.
So
Thank you for that, Harriet. I think, a couple of ideas came up, and I know we're kind of in an hour time, but I wanted to just bring up one other thing, and that is the flexibility of capitalism. This is the last thing I want to ask, and I want a short answer because I want to open it up for a few questions before we finish. There always seems to be a way that the capitalists figure out how to keep the system going, even when it's failing. And I'm looking at the banking system that got bailed out, the military-industrial complex that, as you noted, Harriet, is our war economy. How does that get changed? And the money that controls our politics. And there's always new technology. So there always seems to be a way that the capitalists manage to bail out their system just before it might be opened up to something new and another vision. And I just wondered if you had any comment on that. Is there a possibility here that while the empire's failing, we can also get out of this stranglehold that that capitalism has had on the society.
Rick, you would be better at
Yeah,
responding.
if I could very briefly answer that question. I agree with you. Capitalism has, in fact, shown resilience, the ability to find ways around really difficult problems that have arisen in the history of capitalism, just like comparable problems arose in the history of every other system. The typical history is you solve a lot of these problems. You figure out ways to keep the system going while solving the problems until a time comes when it doesn't. It's not an either or. It just, there may be too many problems accumulating, too many problems kicked down the road, getting worse because you didn't face up to them. Maybe that's how empires in the end kind of end. But here there's a special part, and I'll end with that. I think of capitalism as a basic system that has organized production by setting up two poles. As Harriet put it, the pole of the employer and the pole of the employee. It divides people along those two either-or situations. And in that way, it's not so different from feudalism, which divided everybody into lord and serf, or slavery, which divided everybody into master and slave. So we have employer-employee. And if that's how you understand capitalism, that's what makes it unique, which is how I understand it, then I wouldn't say that capitalism is at the end of its rope. It's US capitalism that is, because capitalism was dynamic, successful, able to overcome its problems in its old centers, Western Europe, North America, and Japan. But what has happened over the last 30, 40 years is that the dynamic, growing center of capitalism moved, it relocated, it left Western Europe, North America, and Japan, and it moved to China, India, Brazil, etc. In those countries who have also organized their systems with employers and employees, they give a much larger role to the government. I know all that, but they hold on to that employer-employee relationship. Their capitalism, their employer-employee relationship is booming right along. China has enormous problems, enormous, starting with a population of 1.4 billion people and a real dearth of all kinds of basic resources like food and water and basic minerals, energy, which they don't produce enough of themselves, and so on. But they are able creatively to solve those problems the way that the West once did. And so I think, ironically, we are watching, as usual, two opposites occurring together. Decline in one part of capitalism, where we are, and explosive growth and success in another. And it's going to be very hard for Americans to be in the position that's not the good one. That's where the people of Asia, Africa, and Latin America were the last 4 centuries. They're done. For them, it's now our turn to be the backwater. And as you watch industry atrophy in the United States, as you watch the public library in cities and towns across the country close down, as you read the statistics, I just was doing it the other day, that we've gone from about 9,000 local newspapers in the last few years to 6,000, and that most of them are weeklies because we don't have a daily newspaper anymore in most. Those are all signs of a system that cannot solve its problems and substitutes symbolism, external adventure, war, all kinds of things, because it can't look at what's happening to it and to face what it means and what extraordinary steps you better take if you want this sad story not to continue.
So I wanted to just think something we haven't talked about at all, and that is, and I don't want to get into it, but it's just something another time to think about, is the climate crisis and how that impacts the economics of the world, of the BRICS countries as well as ours, because that's a whole other dimension that we didn't get into, but it is important.
Sure.
I don't know how you both feel now, because we've been at an hour, and so I'm going to ask you both, do you want to finish, or do you want to take a couple of questions? I will leave it
I'd
up.
love to take some questions because we want to reach people.
Okay, great.
Yes.
So do we have anyone who wants to put their hand up? I will. Okay, I see. If you can be brief, I'm going to start with you, Ben, and then I'll go to Jeff. Ben, you need to unmute.
All right. I can't seem to get my picture up, but I think that for me, the thing that has just really impressed me is the resurgence of the labor movement in this last year. I am amazed at what Sean Fain has done in terms of kind of extending our horizons of action here. I'm really delighted that he's looking at making Strike Day, May Day, is a national contract day. So I'm just, even in this town here, we've got 2 union actions going on. The Sonoma Valley Museum has the culture trying to form they have formed the Cultural Workers Union. They don't have a contract, of course. But the local hotel here, the Sonoma Valley Mission Inn, is basically having a very vigorous, labor action, which was happened just this last Friday out in front of the hotel. And so for me, this is sort of where the main line of action is happening on the left. And so I'm sort of concerned when some of my friends and colleagues from the Green movement are they're kind of troubled, like they're ambivalent whether this is something they should support, because what their metric is, this looks like more industrial activity, more GHG emissions from tourists coming to this town. So I realize that I'm trying to square those 2 perspectives in my mind, because the virtually dominant motif ideologically here is this kind of degrowth concept, which I have learned is like libertarianism.
Can you form a question, Ben?
Yes. My question is this: how does a Marxist such as myself, a self-taught one, deal with the environmental movement, which is primarily focused with the issue of reducing GDP, reducing economic activity in order to reduce emissions? That's my question.
Good.
Well, I want to respond first, and then you do. First of all, there are whole new industries of the solar panels, of wind turbines. There's the Green Alliance that's trying to organize those workers. And there's all sorts of ecological industries to encourage. Plus, really what we need, what your question shows, is a dire need of the United States, which is a unified movement of all the progressive elements, as if socialism was the handle of the umbrella and all the panels were things like climate change and Black Lives Matter and the progressive union movement and sexual rights and patriarchy. which will shield and protect the mass of the American people. That we're just getting to the point, and we don't have a party that stands for us, or even a movement that unifies us. And when we do, we'll move and we'll win, because we are the mass of people. That's what happened in Brazil, so that Lula got elected. That was what happened in Chile, that unity. That was what happened in Colombia, all of whom have socialist leaders now. It was that unity, and that's what we need.
Thank you for that.
Let me try to answer the question directly, picking right up on what Harriet just said. Imagine with me for a moment the following. The climate movement goes to the labor movement and says, we are busy doing a whole host of things about global warming, about pollution, about rising temperature of the water, around all the things that the climate movement largely understood is about. And in order for us to succeed in changing the destruction of this planet, what we need is the labor movement to join us, to bring the power of working people to the demonstrations, to the election campaign. That's what we need. And so we want you to help us. And here's the deal. We will help you. And here's what we, the climate movement, offer you, the labor movement. We will have your back. We will join with you in every town, in every election campaign, and we will favor the following: a guaranteed job and a guaranteed income for every American working adult who's, physically and mentally capable, so that no one can ever scare you again by telling you, you can't go this, you can't do that, because it'll take away your job. That will be over. That threat will have no weight. People will laugh in your face. I don't need the employer to give me something. I'm a citizen. I'm an adult. I am entitled. Like I can walk into the park and bend over and get a drink of water from the public fountain. I will have a job and I will have an income. If the climate movement supports me in that, I will support the climate movement in what its priorities are. And now just extend this to the women's movement, to the fight against racism, and all the other things that we represent. We got to understand, we've got to make a deal. There has to be a reason for the people we want to join us to do it. We want them to understand what we need. Fair enough. But we have to understand what they need and be there for them if we want them to be here with us. The climate people kind of know it, but they're afraid, if I may say so, to challenge capitalism. It's capitalism that doesn't guarantee everybody a job. That's all. Capitalism is a system that says you will have a job if and when an employer can profit from giving you one. And if he can't profit from giving you one, you're screwed. End of story. Okay, why do we accept this? People need a job. A decent society gives people a job and gives them a decent income. If we want to have a decent society, that's what we should. And imagine how working people would feel if the climate activists were carrying signs on their way to protest the next fossil fuel horror saying, we want guaranteed jobs and incomes. And we will only support political candidates that sign on the dotted line, that they're committed to both. That's how you build a solidarity movement. I think we can do that, but we have to stop thinking within the capitalist frame where, look, that's what the employers did in the auto industry and every other. They went to the workers and said, beware those crazy climate people. They're threatening your job. Well, the answer to that was to say, yeah, in this crazy system they are, and we shouldn't let them. If we did this and you did that, we did it together, they wouldn't have the power to take or deny you a job, which they should never have had in the first place.
Right.
I
Yeah,
really
I think what you're pointing out is the coming together of groups, not the
Yeah.
splitting away. And that's been
Right.
a problem in a lot of these, well, I don't know if you call them identity groups, but we need to look at how we can work together instead of continue to see the problem. And
I
that's
think,
Right.
I'm sorry. I
Go
think
ahead.
what we need to do is look at how we can win, and we can't win if we're splintered up into, different groups with different interests. Okay, you need a planet, so do we. We need jobs, so do you. We need to be able to get a job no matter what our color is, and have rights, and no matter what our gender identification is, or our gender, that there is so much commonality. I think we on the left have got to think of winning rather than our own little self-righteous thing against everyone else. But we're not going to win. What we have is the mass of people. What they have is the money.
right.
And they can't function without us.
And what they have is separating us in any way they can.
Exactly.
And that's
Along with
And if we had a movement that guaranteed jobs and incomes, then the working class would have no reason to object to
Right.
producing less. Okay, give us an extra hour of leisure. That everybody works now a 6-hour day, not an 8-hour day. That's who cut back production in a hurry. As long as our incomes are maintained, what you think those workers want to be 8 hours in that automobile factory? They don't. They would like to have leisure. They would like to have time for their children, for their relationships, for their hobbies, for their art, for whatever it is that gives them meaning in their lives. They have enough with their work. They work too much. They work too long. They work 3 jobs, all of the rest of it. We don't need to accept the notion that there's a choice between producing more and saving the planet. Producing more has not been a problem in this country for a long time. You know who worried about producing more? The capitalist who's competing. He's got to produce more to make more money. Otherwise, the competitor will pull the rug out from under him. The impulse to always produce more and more, that comes out of the way capitalism is organized. You didn't even see that in feudalism and slavery. That is a craziness of capitalism that we should have gotten rid of long ago, even before it threatened the survival of the planet. But now that we have that addition, maybe we can go and build the alliances with working people who would love to be told, here's a movement that will back you in having less work to do without compromising what you have for yourself and your family.
You know,
That's a winning program if I ever heard one.
it
And
reminds
having a planet is a winning program too.
it reminds me of Herbert Marcuse had predicted that with all the income that would be on the planet, we wouldn't have to work an 8-hour day. We would have all this leisure. Well, that never happened because the way the capitalist model kept growing. I want to go to Jeff because he's next. Jeff?
Yep. Thanks, Georgia. And Rick, it's really great to meet you. Democracy at Work started me down a path before COVID that it opened up my eyes, and it helped me coin a term, lipstick on the pig, that there's so many things being presented, and when you take the lipstick off, it's still a pig. I do agree with you that we're in this decline. I actually have a timeline. I work towards 2027. And to your point, the economy of the US and China are deeply intertwined. And if the collapse happens here, the collapse happens there. And I want to say I disagree. I think GDP is absolutely the worst measure of an economy, because everybody's heard the saying, if the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. If the only tool we have is capitalism, everything looks like a marketplace. And the carbon credit marketplace is an absolute lipstick on a pig. We're commoditizing people who are doing good things to subsidize people who are doing shit.
Yeah.
Point. Good
Now,
Good for you.
Point.
I want to say also, I don't think this is just an American problem. If we have that mindset, this is a global problem. And here's where I want to get to my question. In my exploration, I got into the work of Elinor Ostrom. And for those that don't know, she's the only woman to win the Nobel Prize in economics. And she solved a problem called the tragedy of the commons. Like, how do we manage a shared pool resource? And the thing nobody's admitting, this planet is a shared pool resource. And we have reached the limits of energy, minerals, land. And until we start to move in that path, and any thoughts or comments you have around what's called the pro-social movement, which is an implementation of Elinor's principles.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. Eleanor's ideas, I wished she had been more, how shall I put this? I wish she had been more exposed to and learned in the Marxian scheme, only because it would have enriched many of her basic insights. But she too was trapped in the field. The Nobel Prize in economics has been given to neoclassical economists, the mainstream. It's been given to some Keynesian economists. It's even been given to a few, let's call them their own thing. But the one school of economics that the Nobel Prize has never been given to is anybody who works in the Marxian tradition. It's an extraordinary. The woman who obviously deserved it, the woman who should have got it while she was still alive, was the British economist at Cambridge named Joan Robinson. For those of you who don't know, really a giant of the profession, far more accomplished. And I don't mean to put down Ostrom at all, but this was a woman. She worked with Keynes. She was a personal friend of Keynes. She was a professor at Cambridge. She went to China and advised Mao. Extraordinary woman that I had for a few times, and Harriet did too, a chance to meet with her and talk with her and spend absolutely extraordinary. But these are different ways of coming at the same idea. The idea of the limited resources. There's a line in Marx, I forget exactly where it is, where this sort of fertile thinker, which is what he was, said, we are concerned about the decimation of nature. We are concerned about the despoiling of the land. He wrote about all, he was aware. He wasn't the only one, but he was aware of those issues. He said, but we ought to, and this is what Harriet does, we ought to wonder about the despoiling of the human spirit, of what happens to a human being working the same job hour after hour in the same underheated, polluted cubicle where they are stuck with whatever machine. What are we doing to those people? What are we doing to those they live with, who will bear the costs of what that does to the brain? And these amazing insights he then never developed. I mean, these were throwaway lines that the fellow did. And I mean this as a compliment. You're telling us, look, there's another way into this, which is the limited resources of this planet. At least until we can go to other planets and discover others, we're stuck here. And if we don't take care of that dependency we have, it will come back and bite us in the rear end, which is, we kind of know that from other parts of our life, that you have to attend to this. So for me, this is almost intellectually, this is what an exciting university would be if it brought in all these different insights, these different ways of thinking about the dead end we've gotten ourselves in. But we don't do that.
We don't
We
face
fill we fill our universities, our economics department, and I've taught, as Georgia was kind enough to say at the beginning, I've taught in half a dozen American universities, including those that are thought to be the hoi polloi and the fancy and the best. They don't do that. They don't bring in outside perspective. They teach and reteach the same, allow me to say it, the same catechism always and over again. They haven't had an original idea blow through there for a long time. That's why they give each other Nobel Prizes, with an occasional odd one. The year she got it, there was a pressure from women economists who looked around the field and noticed how they didn't get the recognition that men economists, which was true then and is true today also. But that's part of this empire dying. It doesn't want to hear an outside perspective. It's too frightening. They don't want to face what they're doing. Let me give you an example. The automobile. The automobile is the single major source of air pollution in the world. The burning of fossil fuels in your car is the #1 polluter. Cars also kill tens of thousands of people every year in the United States, and of course elsewhere too. They use up scarce materials on a scale you've never seen. They injure. They take terribly valuable land throughout our cities and beyond and use it for that. The waste is unbelievable. The private car. What the world needs to solve every one of those problems is mass public transportation. Buses, trains, trolleys, all of it. Technology we know, we've used it before, we could modernize it, and it would save vast amounts of money, vast amounts of fossil fuel, cut back on that's what we need. What are we doing as a planet? We are substituting an electric private car for a gas. Lunacy. No rational judgment could possibly justify this craziness. So we will all have an electric car sitting idle in the garage most of the time until you throw it into a landfill. Unbelievable. And when you see that, and when you see, for example, if you go to China, you come back and the thing you talk about is not the car. They have cars and they are doing private cars. But what they have is the greatest mass transit system the world has ever seen, culminating in a system of rapid trains that the United States is 50 years behind, right?
12
So that's
lines.
at least the beginning of a recognition that the 1.4 billion people over there are going to have to move collectively to save the planet, for among other. But these ways of thinking would be supported if we opened up the space for people to, with these ideas, to get a hearing, to get the attention they deserve, to teach and all the rest, so that people get a chance. And this system is too afraid. It's too afraid, and in that, it replicates the same sad story of every other empire. People looking back, scratching their heads and saying, how could the people in ancient Rome not see that what they were doing was undercutting themselves? It's the great question. Everybody, they're going to do that with us too.
But also,
That's
you don't
exactly
make
what's
money
happening.
off
It's
it.
lipstick on the pig.
Yep. And you don't make money off it. That's one of the reasons that you don't have mass transit. There's so much money in private cars.
Well, absolutely. In 2018, I did a TEDx talk called Living a Values-Based Life, which is about aligning our resources and our action around our values. And, Rick, I appreciate the conversation. I'd love to have some more time if, Georgia can connect you with me. Georgia, thank you for this. I do have to get going. I got another appointment, but
Okay.
great
Yes, I'll be
conversation.
glad to.
Yeah,
be
let's
good.
talk, Jeff. Let's talk soon.
All right. Take care, everyone.
Okay, and I
Goodbye.
don't want to keep you longer. I know we've got people who want to ask questions, but we've been going for over an hour and a half, which I think is probably enough.
Well,
for
maybe what we should do, Georgia, is if there is the interest,